Welcome, and of course, we will start with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And here's where we left off. So we were talking about the significance of the blood in meat and how there is an absolute prohibition about consuming that blood. It's a really severe prohibition, and we're going to go beyond this. So, the sad part about it is we get into this issue of treif or treif meat. We'll discuss that the Torah will actually use that term. There's also another term that's going to be introduced, which is nevela. And the sad part about it, of course, is that so many Jewish people do not observe this particular commandment. I imagine it's better to do it out of ignorance. That is to say, not to do it out of ignorance than to do it out of knowledge and then still be doing it. I'm sorry, but it's unfortunate. At any rate, as I said, these sorts of things, one has to allow God to be the ultimate judge on. And we said yesterday, you don't look down on anybody because they're not observing something that you might be observing. Who knows, right? So then it goes on. Ki nefesh, it explains, and we made an allusion to this yesterday. Ki nefesh, one moment, please. If you are not muted, please check and make sure you're muted. But unless you want to ask a question, thank you. Ki nefesh kol basar, for the life in all flesh, damo benafsho hu. His blood is in his nefesh, in his life. That the hu just simply is like saying it is, right? It is in his life. For Omar livnei Israel, and I have said to the children of Israel, dam kol basar, the blood of any flesh. We've discussed this in the Rashi, why it says any. Lo tochelu, you shall not consume, you shall not eat. Ki nefesh kol basar damohu, because the life of all flesh, all living creatures, damohi, is in its blood. So the he is feminine here, and Rashi explains why in this case it says benafsho hu, that's the masculine he, and he in Hebrew means she, right? Kol ochlav yikaret, anyone who consumes it shall be cut off, shall be subject to karet. And here is the Rashi on damo benafshohu, right? Its blood is in its soul, in its life, is its life. Damo hu lo, okay. The blood is for it, b'makom hanefesh, to represent its life. Shehanefesh tluyabo, because the life of the animal depends on it, depends on the blood. Now look at this. Ki nefesh kol basar damo. It actually is he, right? Even though this is with a vav, which would simply indicate it was who, nevertheless, the pointing, right? The tradition that we have is that we're supposed to pronounce it as he, as the feminine pronoun. For the soul of all flesh is its blood. Hanefesh, that is the soul, right? The life. He hadam is in fact the blood. They're interchangeable. Dam uvasar lashon zachar. And now Rashi explains why that change of pronoun. Because the word dam, the word blood, and the word basar, flesh, meat, right? Lashon zachar, it is masculine. Nefesh, however, the word nefesh, lashon nekeva, it is feminine, the word nefesh. And because the beginning of the phrase, right, if we look at it, the subject here is nefesh, right? The nefesh of all flesh, damohi, that is the nefesh, is its blood, right? And yet here it says its blood is its life. And that's why it is hu, masculine, because dam is the subject here. So, a little technical, but hopefully understandable. Let's go on. Next, oh yes, we need to go up here. And here we are. V'chol nefesh, and any soul, anyone, asher tochal nevela utreva. And here we are introducing a slightly different subject. Anyone who eats a nevela. A nevela is an animal that essentially died on its own. Utrefa, and a treifa. This is the word treif, right? And literally it means torn, but what it means is killed. In other words, an animal that died by itself. We make a distinction between an animal that died by itself and a treifa, which is an animal that was killed. But the point is that it was killed in any way that was not considered shchita. And shchita is this specific way in which kosher animals are slaughtered. Basically, it's instantaneous. There are all kinds of rules that go into it. It has to be done in one stroke, a draw of the knife of the shochet, the one who's doing the slaughter. He has to check the blade to make sure there are no nicks in that blade. The assumption is those nicks would prevent the blade from being drawn in one continuous and quick stroke or deliberate stroke. Both the essentially the esophagus and the windpipe are severed in one stroke, and that causes the animal to basically become unconscious in a second. I've actually witnessed a shchita, a kosher shchita, and I saw how the eyes of the animal glazed over the moment the shochet drew the blade. And then the blood, of course, is allowed to be drained at that point. So that's that. So if it's not slaughtered in that particular way, in other words, if it's killed, whether it's killed by another animal is what this means here, I believe, or was killed in any other way other than shchita. And a nevela, as I said, is an animal that essentially died by itself. Now, the dying by itself, technically in halacha, these are all these rules having to do with making meat kosher. And of course, underneath all of that, I believe, is to do with the fact that taking the life of an animal is something serious. It is not a casual kind of thing to be done just to satisfy human appetite. It is a privilege and has to be treated in this very special way. So what happens is that after the shechit, first of all, the animal is examined before it's even slaughtered to make sure that there is nothing. There are certain kinds of injuries that if the animal has sustained those particular injuries, the assumption is that it would not live out the year. That is also taken into consideration as an animal that died by itself. In other words, if it's estimated that the animal would die within a year, within 12 months, that is considered a nevela. After the animal is slaughtered, so assuming it passes those particular examinations, the animal is then examined in its lungs. The lungs are examined. The lungs are considered very susceptible to disease, and that, of course, you gotta breathe. So if an animal's lungs show certain adhesions, again, the assumption is, and again, one has to develop expertise. One has to go through a whole process of learning in order to be able to determine. These are called sirchot, adhesions, that if the lungs have certain types of adhesions, the animal would be assumed to die within the year. And again, it would not be consumable. It would be considered nevela. So there's also another difference between this category of a nevela and a category of a treifa. We may not have actually read it ourselves, but previously in the book of Leviticus, it talked about the fact that nevela, that consuming nevela or being in, and with regard to an animal as opposed to a bird, if you touch a nevela, it renders you impure, whereas a treifa does not do that. Okay, so, but Ezrach uvager, whether it is a Ezrach, meaning a born Jew, a Jew who's born as a Jew, uvager, we've already come across this term, right? Or a person who associates, becomes Jewish, v'chibes bagadav, right? If you eat such animals, you have to launder your clothes. So it's a very severe kind of impurity. It's quite a severe impurity. V'rachatz b'mayim, and this means literally wash in water, but that actually means to go to the mikveh, to immerse oneself. V'tamei ad ha'arev, and this person, after having done that, is still tamei, he's still considered impure up until nightfall, the taher, and at that point, he can become pure. Now, you may be wondering, wait a second, didn't I say that treifa does not render you impure? Yes, that is correct, but we'll have to see. Rashi will, I believe, explain why the category of treifa is in this sentence as well.
Why does, what do you do with animals who die or are not consumable?
Right. So this law is only given to the members of the Jewish people. That there's remember, we're supposed to be, at the giving of the Ten Commandments, he talks about us being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the idea is that there are certain mitzvot that, of course, many mitzvot that are only applicable if you are a Jew or want to act as a Jew, an Israelite. And so this particular law does not apply to Gentiles. And so if the animal is healthy enough that, let's put it this way, that the FDA would consider it appropriate to be consumed, you can sell it to a Gentile. Gentiles are not commanded to eat kosher meat. They are not part of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Do you want to follow that up, Judith? Okay.
No, I don't, but I can't see how that would work.
In what sense? Tell me.
Well, is everywhere Jews lived? Was this, possible, in Tevye's village?
Yes.
Would they have non-Jews who would buy meat from them?
They would. They would. They were not. If that's not the case, then I guess you have to turn it into fertilizer or something like that. You burn it, turn it into fertilizer. But no, I believe that, and again, remember the price of such meat, since you need to get rid of it, the price would be quite reasonable.
Can you use the leather and etc.?
Oh, good question. Good question. So that's a wonderful question. And it's possible that I would actually have
not for a Torah, but yeah.
Oh, no, not for a Torah. You know something, if it's a nevela and it renders you impure, it would seem to me that you cannot use the leather of a nevela, but you might be able to use the leather of a treifa. It's a really great question. And again, this is the kind of stuff that becomes grist for the oral Torah, because the oral Torah deals with exactly that kind of practical question. It is a very practical question because here, clearly, we're talking about consuming, right? We're talking about eating here. So whether or not you can use that parts of the animal, I would think that with a nevela, essentially, you don't have a choice. And the truth is that if an animal, I mentioned the FDA. By the way, notice that the standards of kosher slaughter are much higher than that of the FDA. But I know that in Jewish in slaughterhouses where they do shechita, very often they do both kinds. It does happen that they'll do both kinds of slaughtering. And that it becomes, if the FDA approves of it, and it passes that kind of examination, it becomes part of the non-Jewish, market. So I cannot answer that question. I just don't know enough to be able to answer that question, in a determinate kind of way. It's a great
One
question.
more question.
Of course.
What, how does a shochet purify himself if he becomes impure with, he comes across a,
Yes.
how do they do that now?
Okay, so again, I think what they would do is they would go to the mikveh. That's why we have a mikveh. So I think that's what a shochet would have to do. I mean, I think by examining the animal ahead of time, remember, it's only if you consume it that you become impure. So it's not if you, in this particular case, it's not if you touch it, right? At least it says asher tochal, who eats. Let's take a look at the Rashi. Again, an excellent question, but I see here that it's talking about this. So let's take a look at what Rashi says, and you can see that it's somewhat extensive here. It goes all the way to here. So, asher tochal nevela v'trefa, who shall eat, right? Who shall consume a nevela or a trefa. And he says, "Benivlat of tahor diber hakatuv," that here Scripture is talking specifically about the nevela of a bird that is pure, that a bird that is not considered tameh, and he's going to prove that. And he says that's what it's talking about here. Okay, let me keep going. Okay. She'ein la tum'ah, because a bird that is either a nevela or trefa, ein la tum'ah ela b'sha'at, because you are not rendered impure through such a bird, ela b'sha'ah shenivla'et beveit hable'ah. You only become impure the moment the food, if you're ingesting this bird, eating this bird, you become impure only at the moment when you swallow the food. When you swallow the food, that's when you become tameh. But just touching it doesn't render you tameh, this particular bird, right? V'limed kan, and it teaches you here, shemit amah ba'achilata, that it only renders you impure when you eat it, when you consume it. Ve'ena mit amah b'maga, however, it does not render you impure when you touch it. So he's saying that this particular verse is talking about birds, pure birds, not impure birds, and he's going to prove that. Okay, so let's see. All right, utrefa amurakan, and a treif animal that is referenced here, lo nichtava, it was not written. Okay, it's not in this verse because remember, it doesn't operate this way. It's not a nevela, right? Ela lidrosh. It's only there for us to interpret. That's the reason it's there. V'chein shaninu, and so we learned out. Yachol tahei nivlat of tameh mitamah bebeit habliah. Should we suggest, remember we said this law only applies to pure birds, and he says, well, maybe we might want to suggest that it also, that a nevela, right, and the nevela of an of tameh, of an impure bird, also renders you impure when you swallow it. Talmud loma trefa. For this reason, it uses, this verse mentions trefa. Mi sheyesh b'mino trefa. You have to refer to something, it only has to do with something that has in its species the concept of trefa. In other words, it has to be possible that this bird is treif. If it's an impure bird, the issue of treif doesn't apply at all. It's verboten, period. It's only when you come to pure birds that the idea of something being treif is applicable. And I will give you the classic example in a moment, the sort of Yeah, okay. Yatsa of tamei, and for this reason, the word trefa lets you know that an impure bird is excluded. She'ein bemino trefa, because no kind of impure bird it can be, the category of trefa cannot be applied to an impure bird, and it's the famous question, the famous quote halachic question of what's the bracha over a cheeseburger? Okay, and the reason why it's it's a sort of irrelevant question, right? The moment you make it into a cheeseburger, okay, first of all, if the meat itself isn't kosher, the idea of mixing milk and meat is irrelevant. Okay, it's the same kind of idea. The mixing of milk and meat only applies to kosher meat. There, the mixing of milk and meat has halachic significance. But if you're already eating non-kosher meat, whether you mix it with milk or not is totally irrelevant. I mean, there's no bracha for it, obviously. So likewise, this is exactly the argument that's going here, that we have to be talking about kosher birds, that the word trefa here is to tell you that it has to be capable of being rendered or being considered treif. The idea of a treif non-kosher animal it doesn't apply.
What about Impossible Burgers?
So Impossible Burgers, yes, they're wonderful. Yeah, no.
They're absolutely
they
wonderful.
are fine. So the issue of treif doesn't apply to Impossible Burgers either.
No. The bracha.
Oh, the bracha over that would be probably of Mot11Lev17vs14 in the Aretz. I would
if you're eating bread,
because it's bread, and bread takes precedence.
Bread trumps everything.
It does. Yes.
Okay.
So this is, and of course, we're talking here sadly, I'm saying sadly, I shouldn't say sadly, right? But it's about current practices. This is something that you either, you're willing to take this on, and it's I think it's a process. Okay. But here is something that speaks to current life. I don't believe there's any problem with having an Impossible Burger with cheese on it. Okay, I mean, you might say, well, I personally don't like the taste, so I choose not to have it. But I don't think it's halachically forbidden, even as a gzeira. Again, I'm not a posek. I'm not someone. A posek is someone who is an expert at Jewish law and is capable of making legal decisions based on their expertise. So, I mean, it could sort of come under the idea of a siag, that is a law that is put in place to prevent the negation of a real law. Okay, so for example, since you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbat, you don't handle matches. Okay, is handling matches in and of itself forbidden on Shabbat? And the answer is no, it's not forbidden, but it's rabbinically forbidden as a siag, as a fence to prevent you from actually winding up to strike the match. It is something, there's no reason for you to be handling, kindling matches on Shabbos. So whether or not, go ahead.
So I was going to say, technically, then there is a bracha over a cheeseburger, right? Or not technically, practically, you wind up with that, right? Depending on how you define cheeseburger in this case, right?
It's not
which
meat,
which is kind of My point, though, besides the joke, is that, but that's also the point of this whole thing, right? Depending on how you define things, how we view them changes significantly.
Right. And this is actually a very beautiful little piece that we're studying today that gives you some insight into how halacha works, and how carefully they need to analyze the categories to be able to come up with a correct answer. So let's see. Okay, I think we should stop here only because there's another Rashi here. We will meet tomorrow, because my grandson is on vacation, and but we won't be meeting Friday because it's Yom Tov. It's the last 2 days of Pesach. So God willing, we will meet tomorrow. So we will finish up here. And I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording.